A wagon creaked up the mountain trail, its wheels moaning beneath the weight of a cage built for shame. Snow had just begun to fall, soft flakes drifting over the pines. Sheriff Wade McCraw rode up front, his coat stiff with dust, his face mean with satisfaction. Inside the cage sat a woman wrapped in a torn shawl, her cheeks raw from wind and humiliation. She wasn't fighting anymore. Her hands lay limp in her lap. The sign nailed to the bars read only one word: thief. When they reached the ridge, the sheriff tugged his reins, stopping before a lonely cabin buried deep in the Rockies. Smoke coiled from its chimney, gray and slow against the evening sky. "Boone," McCraw hollered. "Got a gift for you." The door opened, and out stepped Elias Boone, a tall man with a beard like storm clouds and eyes as cold as the river behind him. The sheriff tossed a ring of keys into the snow. "Town don't want her. She's your problem now." Elias said nothing. He just looked at the woman, at her shaking shoulders, her cracked hands, the defeat in her eyes. Then he looked at McCraw, whose smirk curved cruel in the dusk. "See you in hell, Boone," the sheriff said, and rode away, his laughter echoing down the trail until it vanished into the trees. The woman didn't move. Her breath made little clouds in the air. Elias stepped forward, unlatched the cage, and gestured toward the cabin. "Fire's warm," he said simply. She hesitated, then followed him inside. Elias Boone hadn't shared his home with a soul in 12 years. He'd buried his wife, Clara, out behind the oak tree when the fever took her. Since then, he'd lived alone, hammering metal, chopping wood, eating in silence. The mountains were his only company. Now this woman, this stranger, sat by his hearth, eyes wide and unsure. She was heavy-set and tired, her brown hair knotted, her frame trembling from cold. "Mara," she whispered when he asked her name. "Mara Dillard." He gave a brief nod. "You hungry?" She nodded, barely. He ladled soup into a tin bowl, set it before her, and stepped back into the shadows. For a long while, the only sound was the spoon touching the sides of the bowl and the wind sighing against the door. When she finished, she tried to thank him. He just pointed to a cot by the wall. "You can rest there." "Sheriff said I'm to stay with you," she murmured. "I didn't ask him for that," Elias replied, voice low. "I didn't ask for it neither." Their eyes met in the lamplight. Two strangers bound by someone else's cruelty. The next few days passed in awkward quiet. Mara swept the floor, mended what she could find to fix, and avoided looking at him for too long. Elias went about his work, hauling wood, melting snow for water, shaping iron on the anvil he'd built years ago. He didn't speak much, but sometimes he caught himself glancing at her, how she moved softly, trying not to disturb anything, as if afraid her very presence might break the silence. One morning, she stepped outside to watch him split logs. He worked with slow, sure power. The axe rose and fell in rhythm, the sound echoing through the trees. When he noticed her watching, he paused. Their eyes met again, brief, startled. She looked away, cheeks flushed, and hurried back inside. That evening, he returned to find stew simmering over the fire. "Didn't ask for that," he muttered, hanging his coat. "Didn't figure you had to," she said. Stirring, the quiet between them softened, just a little. A week later, Elias rode down to Bitter Creek for supplies. The moment he tied his horse outside the general store, he felt the stares. Hattie Vale, the innkeeper, leaned against her porch rail with a grin sharp as a knife. "Heard you took in a woman, Boone," she called out. "Big one, too. Sheriff says she's keeping your cabin warm now." The men on the boardwalk laughed. Elias ignored them, bought his nails, flour, and salt, and left without a word. But the laughter followed him down the road like a curse. When he returned to the cabin, Mara looked up from mending a torn sleeve and knew. She saw the shame in his eyes before he said anything. "They know," she whispered. He nodded once. "I can go," she said quietly, gathering her things. "Ain't the first time folks thought me trouble." He caught her hand before she could move. His palm was rough, his voice rougher. "No one's asking you to go." For a moment, she froze. Then, slowly, she sank back into her chair. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Outside, snow began to drift again, gentle and soundless. Winter tightened its grip, and with it came a strange peace. They learned each other's rhythms. He chopped, she cooked. He forged, she mended. Some nights, when the fire was low and the wind howled like the past itself. He told her stories of the world he'd left behind, the wife who'd smiled through sickness, the daughter he never got to raise. Mara listened, her hands folded, her heart aching for him. "You're not as mean as you look," she said one night, a hint of warmth in her tone. He chuckled, a sound so rare it startled her. "And you're not as bad as they say." Something softened then, invisible but real. The air between them changed, less of a cell, more of a shelter, but the mountains still had storms to spare. One night, as snow hammered the roof and wind roared like wolves, Mara spoke softly through the storm. "I never stole that money," she said, voice trembling. "They just needed someone to blame. The saloon's safe was short, and I was the one folks already laughed at. Fat girl's always the fool, they said. Easier that way." Elias turned from the window, studying her face. "Folks don't see what they're afraid to understand," he said after a moment. She met his eyes, and in them she saw no pity, only quiet recognition. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a joke, as a person. Outside, the storm softened to a hush. Inside, something thawed that neither dared name. The fire crackled, slow and steady, as two wounded souls sat side by side in the flicker of forgiveness, waiting for the dawn. By the time the snow began to melt, the world outside the cabin had turned to glass and mud. The creek ran louder, swollen with the thaw, and the pines shook loose the weight of winter. Mara tended a small patch of earth behind the cabin where the first shoots of green dared to rise. Elias watched her sometimes from the porch, quiet as always, pipe smoke curling into the pale morning air. She had begun to hum again, soft songs from the saloon days, slow and wistful. The cabin no longer felt like a cage. It felt like something else entirely, fragile piece stitched together by two lonely hearts. Then one morning, the stillness broke that a horse's cry echoed through the valley, followed by laughter, the kind Elias knew too well. Sheriff McCraw rode up the slope with two deputies behind him, their boots and spurs jangling. Dust followed them like arrogance. Mara froze by the garden, her hands full of seed. Elias stepped off the porch, his face unreadable. "Well, look at that," McCraw said, grinning. "The mountain man and his lady prisoner. Seems domestic life suits her fine." "What do you want, Sheriff?" Elias asked. "Justice," McCraw said, spitting into the dirt. "Town's short on entertainment, and a trial'll do nicely. Time to bring your guest back where she belongs." Elias's jaw tightened. "She's done her time. She's mine by law," McCraw sneered. "And law's what keeps this land from turning wild." "Then maybe wild's what it needs," Elias said. The air thickened. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. McCraw smirked, flicking his reins. "You forget who you're talking to, Boone." "I remember," Elias said quietly. "I just stopped caring." He stepped between the sheriff and Mara, his broad frame blocking her from view. McCraw's smile faltered. "Move aside." "No." That one word hung there like a gun cocking. The sheriff dismounted, swaggering closer. "Didn't figure you'd get sweet on her. You're welcome to keep her, Boone. But I'll tell the town what you've been doing up here. Fat thief and mountain hermit, playing house in sin." The deputies chuckled behind him. Mara's face flushed red, her eyes filling with shame. She thought she'd left behind. McCraw turned toward her. "You think this man cares for you? He's just lonely enough to take what he can get." That did it. Elias moved before the words could finish leaving the sheriff's mouth. His fist landed square across McCraw's jaw, dropping him into the mud. The deputies shouted, rifles raised. Elias didn't flinch. "You'll have to go through me," he said. McCraw staggered up, wiping blood from his mouth. "You'll hang for that." Elias stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "Then make it worth it." The first shot cracked the silence. A bullet tore into a tree trunk behind Mara. She ducked, screaming, as Elias lunged at the nearest deputy, knocking him flat. The other fired wildly, but Elias's rage was faster. He drove a shoulder into him. Wrenching the rifle free, McCraw drew his pistol. Shaking now, but Elias was on him, tackling him into the slush near the creek. They rolled through the mud, fists flying, until McCraw's weapon slid across the ground. Mara scrambled toward it, her breath ragged, heart pounding in her throat. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. "Stop," she cried, voice trembling. McCraw froze, face bloodied, eyes wide. "You wouldn't shoot." Mara's hands shook, but she raised the gun. "No," she said softly, "but I'll make sure you walk away." For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The only sound was the creek roaring with spring melt. Then Elias rose beside her, steady and tall, his hand resting gently on her arm. "You tell your town she's free," he said to McCraw. "She's paid enough." McCraw spat into the dirt, but the fight had gone out of him. He gestured to his deputies, who were already backing away. They mounted their horses and rode off, their shame echoing louder than their hooves. When the last sound faded, Mara's knees gave out. The gun slipped from her hands. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and warm. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "They'll come back." "Let 'em," he said softly. "I've been alone too long to be afraid anymore." She looked up at him, eyes searching. There, in the shadow of the mountains, something wordless passed between them, a recognition, a promise. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, then stood and helped her inside. The fire was still burning. He poured her a cup of water, his hands shaking slightly for the first time in years. She reached for it, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away. Outside, the storm clouds were clearing. Light broke through the pines, scattering across the clearing where blood and snow had mixed. The weeks that followed moved slow and tender. No one came up the ridge again. News traveled fast in Bitter Creek, and by the time the talk reached the trading post, the story had changed. The sheriff picked a fight he couldn't win. The mountain man stood for the woman the law threw away. Elias and Mara rebuilt the cabin together. She planted her garden anew, rows of green sprouting from the thawed earth. He forged her a small iron kettle, polished it until it shone. Sometimes, when the sun went down and the air turned soft, he'd sit beside her on the porch, saying little. She'd rest her hands in her lap, watching the light fade from gold to blue. One evening, she said quietly, "You never asked why I stayed." He smiled faintly. "Didn't need to." "Why not?" "Because I already know." She looked at him then, eyes reflecting the twilight. "And what's that?" "That this place finally feels like it's got a heartbeat again." Her lips trembled into a smile. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The seasons turned again. The garden grew wild and green. Traders passing through the mountain spoke of them, the fat woman and the mountain man who defied the sheriff, who lived quiet and proud up where the world forgot to look. One evening, Elias leaned on his porch rail as Mara knelt by her garden, the sky painted orange and rose. He said, half to himself, "Guess some problems are worth keeping." Mara looked up, smiling through the fading light. "Guess some are worth saving." The wind carried the scent of pine and rain as the sun dipped behind the ridge, and if you listened close, you could almost hear the story being told, an old voice, soft and sure, speaking not of heroes or beauty, but of mercy. In a land that worshipped strength, it was gentleness that saved them. And in the hearts the world cast aside, grace found a home.